This is episode number 79, featuring Marc Dalessio, the amazing American artist who lives in Florence, Italy. You don't want to miss this one. Welcome to the PleinAir podcast from PleinAir magazine. I'm your host, Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of PleinAir magazine. Inside the PleinAir podcast, we dive into the world of outdoor painting called plein air painting. For those of you who don't know, plein air is a French term essentially meaning outside or the open air. The French say plein air, others say plein air. It doesn't really matter what words you use. It's a huge movement of artists around the world going outside to paint, and this show is about that movement. I want to thank everybody. I'm still reeling from the Plein Air convention we did back in April in Santa Fe. I want to thank everybody. What an amazing week. Every day I get letters, not letters, but emails and Facebook posts about paintings people have done and the exciting time they had. So thank you very much. Also, thanks for all the people who bought the book there. My book, I've got a new book out, and thanks for the people buying it on Amazon. There are no words other than thank you. I will see you in San Francisco for next year's Plein Air convention. The podcast is brought to you by my newest event. We do a thing in fall every year. I call it Fall Color Week. It's an idea about getting out and painting a week of fall color. And typically the last 3 years we've done it in Maine, but I wanted to change it up. And so we're going to the Canadian Rockies. And the place we're staying is kind of like Yosemite Valley. Big, giant mountains on top of you, except they're a lot bigger than Yosemite. It's pretty amazing. It's coming up in October, and it's a chance to just roll out of bed every day, stay in a beautiful place, have all your meals served to you, and paint all day. There's no competitions, no show, just a chance to paint with friends. And this year, it's going to be in and around Banff, Lake Louise, and the Canadian Rockies area. It's just beautiful. It's a ball. It's limited to 125 people. And, of course, after a week, we get pretty close together. So it's a chance to make some new friends, to laugh a lot, to paint a lot, to do some music, have a lot of fun. And it's a really good way to get good at painting, too. When you get out doing 2 or 3 paintings a day, you can walk out in your pajamas. You can go out on the balcony of your room and do beautiful paintings. So you can just get a lot of painting done. Anyway, there's some openings left. You can visit publishersinvitational.com and click on the Canada link. It's my desire to see more people fall in love with plein air painting. I know I did, and you can help by sharing this podcast with your friends on social media or email. And I hope you'll subscribe on iTunes so it shows up every week. And, of course, we'd love your comments. And if you haven't got our ebook yet, 240 Tips on Plein Air Painting, it's got some of the top painters and a lot of great tips. It's free. Pick it up at pleinairtips.com. We spell plein, Plein, pleinairtips.com. And if you have feedback, reach me, Eric, at pleinairmagazine.com. The interview is also underwritten by the next Publisher's Invitational trip, African Painting Safari. What a beautiful bucket list trip this is going to be. A chance to go on safari in Africa live, beautiful animals surrounding you. It's not all about animal painting, though. We're going to have a day and a half or 2 days of safari, but the rest of it is painting the beautiful scenery of Africa. Luxury accommodations, great sightseeing, painting. We're going to do Victoria Falls, waterfalls, Table Mountain, some of the most spectacular scenery. I'm told, I've never been, but I'm told by somebody who just went that it's kind of like New Zealand. It's just unbelievably beautiful. And something that, we think about Africa, we think about animals, but there's so much more to it. So anyway, you can bring your spouse or your partner. It's going to be a blast. We still have seats left on that, but you got to get the paperwork done soon because there's some visas and things required. Anyway, the trip is this September, and you can learn more at AfricanPaintingSafari.com. Okay, let's get right to the interview with Marc Dalessio. Welcome, Marc Dalessio.
Thank you very much.
So, Marc, you're living in Florence, Italy?
Yeah, just outside of Florence, actually.
In what town?
It's called Bagno Ripoli. It's just up on the hill. We sort of look down over the city. So it's a very beautiful old villa. it's all covered with frescoes, and it has a beautiful garden in front and a great view.
So you're living the dream.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. We got very lucky. My wife found it online, and we were looking for something on this side of town because my wife is currently studying at the Florence Academy.
So I want to talk a little bit about Italy. I know you grew up in California. We'll talk about that in a minute. But since we're on to Italy right now, as Americans, especially artists, we have these visions of what it would be like to move to and live in Italy, maybe go to school there, paint a lot. What's it like after you've done it for a while? You've been over there how long?
About 25 years.
Oh, have you really?
Yeah. I
So,
came on a year abroad program in 1992, and I discovered Charles Cecil Studios. And so it was exactly what I had been looking for. And so I just stayed.
So from the perspective of an American, obviously it must be pretty wonderful if you stayed for 25 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, I came, like I say, just out of college. And back in those days, you couldn't really find, I was looking for somebody who could teach me traditional painting. And as it turns out, there were lots of places I could have studied in the US, but because there was no internet or anything, couldn't find them. So I came to Florence thinking maybe somebody in Europe could teach me traditional painting, which is what I was interested in. And, by sheer luck, Florence ended up being probably one of the only places in Europe at the time where I could have picked up the training I was looking for. And so I stumbled into Charles Cecil Studios. And yeah, it was, when you were young, especially in the 90s, the cost of living was so low, and I wasn't going to make much money for a while. So I was able to live in a beautiful farmhouse in Tuscany with other students, and Charles gave me a room in the studio downtown, so I sort of had a pied-à-terre in town, and it's just a wonderful existence. So he gave me a job there after a while, so I just stayed.
So the Charles and Dan Graves at the Florence Academy used to be, I think they started out together and then they ended up going out on their own. What are the distinctions, because you teach at Florence Academy as well, and since you studied at Charles Cecil, what are the distinctions? Is there a difference between those two? Not necessarily a right or wrong, but what's the difference in, say, the training or the system, or maybe even the style?
Well, they both, like you said, they had a school together, and so they're technically they're similar in the sense that you begin with casts. The Florence Academy has you do bark drawings first and then casts. Cecil just starts with casts. But then the program is quite similar in the sense that each gives you the nude half of the day, and then with Cecil it's portraiture the other half of the day. And it's both are based on the site size method, limited palettes, and there's subtle differences between the two. But I would say these days Cecil has become very focused on portraiture. So like the advanced students tend to do sometimes they'll do 6 hours a day of portraits, and whereas the Florence Academy does still life, and they continue doing figurative stuff through the whole course. I haven't worked with Cecil for many years, but back in those days that was the only real. The difference was a bit the focus of the two schools.
So did you start out with the goal of becoming a landscape painter?
No, when, like I say, Cecil's focus was portraiture. So I just thought I would become a portrait painter as well. And the site size method works brilliantly for portraiture. So when I was at the school, I focused on portraits. We would do a lot of landscapes in the mornings and in the summers. And Cecil was very generous with us. He took us landscape painting on the weekends and taught us everything that he had learned about landscape painting, but it wasn't really an interest of mine. I thought I would become a portrait painter, but after I painted portraits for a number of years, I sort of realized that I preferred the freedom. I preferred being outside. Working as a professional portrait painter means you are required to work a lot with the clients and basically come up with a solution to, it's a bit what they want and what you want, and combining the two.
Yeah. Don't make me look so old.
Yeah, that sort of thing. But it's so it can be interesting. I think in some ways it's great to have these things that sort of boundaries that you have to push against and restrictions. I think a lot of the best art, and certainly in the Western canon, was produced with on commission, and somebody had a certain idea they wanted to present, like the old Hollywood producer would find the director for his vision. And that was a bit the same with artists. But I realized quite early on that I much preferred the life of a landscape painter, because you basically are outside and you can do whatever you want. And so,
how much are you outside? How much do you do plein air painting?
I mean, it depends on the time of year. There's seasons that I prefer. Like, I'm not a big fan of early spring, which we're just getting out of. It's here in Italy, it tends to be a lot of browns and acid greens. So I have to do a lot of studio paintings for my exhibitions. And so in the seasons when I'm not as enthusiastic about the colors, I tend to work inside. But now when the season starts to pick up, May is just gorgeous here in Italy. So today it was pouring rain and I was outside painting in the rain. So I would say in the summer, certainly I'm outside, 8 or 10 hours, especially if I'm traveling.
So I'm not sure how to articulate this, but in looking at your paintings and really the work of some of the others who have come out of similar types of training, there's a richness about it that I don't see typically throughout painters in America. Is there a way to articulate why that might be?
I don't really know. I mean, I think that what I really appreciate about what Charles taught us was, and the same goes for the Florence Academy, is their focus on technical, basically on the materials. So like at Charles's school, we would grind our own paint by hand because the results are much better than if you buy tube paint. Now, these days, you've got a lot of these sort of boutique producers who are making great paints. And in fact, I've stopped for the most part making my own paints. But back then, like the lead white, you could get these stringy effects that you really can't get with any tube paint I've ever seen. But the other thing that Cecil recommended, I see a lot of painters in America and in England using these sort of alkyd mediums, whereas with Cecil we're using, the medium that I use that I got from Cecil, it's based on these Baroque manuscripts, and it's a wonderful medium for being able to glaze, and it keeps a luminosity in the paint. It's I find it absolutely beautiful to work with. You can get all kinds of great, it's wonderful for painting with a bit of, I'm not actually using turpentine right now, I use lavender oil, but to thin it out, it will disperse the pigment very well. And then, you can hit the impastos in it and keep the soft edges. And it's just a wonderful medium to paint with. And I think that maybe, gives a certain gloss and a luminosity that is what you see in a lot of old master paintings.
So, two questions related to that. You said lavender oil. Are you just using pure lavender oil, or are you using a product that's based on lavender oil?
Well, we have this great art store in Florence called Zecchi.
What a great store, yeah.
Yeah, and so Sandro, they actually sell two kinds of lavender oil. One is called lavender oil, and the other is called spike oil. Now, I've seen spike oil for sale in the U.S., but he claims that the lavender oil is a more refined, sort of a better quality spike oil. So that's what I'm using. But I'm just using that as the
brush cleaner.
as the thinner. So my main medium is sun-thickened linseed oil mixed with Canada balsam, which, like I say, comes from there was a doctor who studied painting with Van Dyck, and he wrote some of Van Dyck's recipes. Now, Van Dyck wasn't using Canada balsam, he was using something called Strasbourg turpentine. But the Strasbourg turpentine we find on the market today is very brown, whereas he describes it as a straw color. And as it turns out, Canada balsam is from a similar tree, and it's used in industry. It's got some very special properties that physicists and people who work in optics need. So you can get a very high quality of it, and our stores have discovered this, and so it's easily available.
So what's the ratio is to sun-thickened linseed to Canada balsam?
I do half and half. Other people maybe less or more. Some people add a varnish, which I don't really trust. But so it's half Canada balsam to sun-thickened linseed oil. But the Canada balsam has to be cut first with turpentine because it tends to be too thick otherwise.
And the sun-thickened linseed oil, are you making your own? Are you doing cleaning it like Dan Graves is doing?
No, I did for many years, but we, like I say, the Zeki is fantastic because they're very receptive to if we say, look, we need this stuff, they will figure out a way. So I think one of the guys at Zeki actually thickens it himself. He has a beach house or something, so he makes it every summer. And the quality's exactly the way mine used to be, so I just get theirs.
Now, are you still painting in a limited palette? And if so, what are you painting with?
Yeah, like I say, I mean, the limited palette was more for figurative stuff, and that was just black, ochre, vermilion, and a lead white, which is a great flesh palette. But now that I work outside, I've switched to titanium white just because I find it covers much better. And then I use like a cadmium yellow. I basically use the three primaries in a warm and a cool variant. So cadmium yellow light and a cadmium yellow medium. I use an ochre, which I don't really need, but that's a color I would end up mixing so much that it's a quick shortcut. I use a cad red vermilion and a cad red medium. I sometimes will use alizarin for glazing in the studio later. I use cerulean blue, a cobalt blue, and an ultramarine blue. Again, the cobalt is just a shortcut because I found myself mixing cerulean and ultramarine so much to get a middle. And that's it. Today I was painting irises in the garden, so I was using purple. But like I say, I used to grind my own paints, and then I realized the quality of the paints has gotten so good. I use Williamsburg, especially for the cadmiums. And if I compare my hand ground cadmiums to a Williamsburg cadmium, I see very little difference. So it's just much less work.
Yeah, grinding is a lot of work. And interesting that you switched from lead white to titanium. Lead is usually so wonderful to work with.
It's wonderful, especially for figures, because it's slightly transparent, and like I say, for impastos, it's wonderful. But I found that for working outside, like to do a sky with lead white, it just takes, you spend half the session just laying in the sky, whereas titanium, it's much faster. And I find that a lot of the work I use is, painting the sort of negative shapes with white, with lights. And it's just much easier it's much more responsive. And I think a lot of plein air painting is much more, especially for sketches, it's often a one-shot painting and you have to be much quicker. Whereas figurative work with using lead white tended to be multiple sessions, and, the speed wasn't necessarily so important.
Yeah. So it appears you're doing site-size painting when you're outdoors. I oftentimes will see a photo on your website or something you've sent out where you can see the canvas and it's exactly lined up with the scene. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes and no. I mean, I find that I do that sometimes. I find it kind of entertaining. Honestly, I should say that the first time I saw that done, somebody took a photograph of one of my paintings, lining up these strong, the diagonals or horizontals or verticals or whatever. But to me, I find it a bit false. They do it because people seem to react well to it, but it's not representative of site size, because if you look at any one particular object and then you look at the same thing just to the right of canvas, it tends to be much smaller on the panel. I mean, I basically have to get those photos, I have to move back and just line up some strong,
right,
like I say, horizontal or diagonal. But anybody can do that. It's not, even if you're not site sizing, it's just getting the camera in the right place.
Yeah, but in terms of not in terms of the photographing part, but are you painting in site size?
Yes, I do. I use site size a lot outside, especially for my smaller sketches. It's just a very fast way to get your proportions right. I mean, it was used we were taught it as a portraiture technique where you have to be very fast and very accurate. If you paint a portrait commission, after the first half hour, the client is sort of, leaning around the canvas to see how it's coming, and you have to be accurate from the get-go. So we're working outside where the light is fleeting and the effects are changing, and maybe the car you're painting is about to drive off. I find the speed that site size gives me to be very useful. And so I tend to do, especially my smaller work, is always done site size outside.
And are you using a frame like Joe McGurl is using, or are you simply just telling yourself, okay, this is where the edge of the painting is going to be, and using a string or whatever to line things up?
No, because I guess just from doing it so long, I found I don't need the frame. I mean, I have sort of an imaginary frame in my head. Also, my own philosophy for me, when I was in university, I actually studied biology. And there was something that they told us early on, that a biologist is basically nature studying nature itself. Yeah, we're part of nature. And so I always loved that idea that we were going out and studying ourselves, basically, in the natural world that we are a part of. And then when I came to Florence, when I discovered site size, to me it seemed like the artist was part of nature, going out and painting, revering, falling in love with itself. It's kind of it's part of this circle where the artist is part of the natural world. And so I always was trying to be as true to nature as possible. So when I discovered site size, to me, it worked perfectly with my own philosophy on how I wanted to approach painting to begin with. So I find it very useful. I mean, I think I've read criticisms of site size where it's seen as being sort of superficial and just flattening the image out in the heads, but I think that it's not really accurate. I mean, certainly when we were studying site size at these schools, we had to do, a ton of anatomy studies and trying to understand the muscles and the bones and everything that's underneath the image, and thinking about how to get a shape to turn and the space. And the same when I go outside, I am thinking about the atmospheric effects, the planes, the where the light's hitting these things. So it's not just flattening the image out in my head and copying it, but it's very quick, and it's a way to be very quick and accurate at the same time when you need to be.
I found that I started doing site size when I studied with Joe McGurl, and suddenly everything just kind of fell in place. It took me a while. It was a slower process in the beginning, but once I really started doing it, the accuracy of my drawing was so much better.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing it today, painting, and it's just, it's 2 hours or 3 or 4 hours, depending on what time of day you're working, a really, really intense concentration. And sometimes it's easy to get onto autopilot, and, you start, our brain is designed to look for patterns and to do things that don't work in a painting necessarily. And so switching, from actually trying to think about your, the objects and the space and everything, and then switching back into the flat image and flicking your eye back and forth and measuring the shapes. It's such a easy way to make sure your shapes and even the values and the colors are good. You flick your eye back and forth and stuff jumps. If it doesn't jump, it's fine. It's good. It's in the right place. If it jumps, it's in the wrong place. So
you talk a little bit in your website. You have a paragraph about the short treatise describing God's creation of man, saying that there is some creature to comprehend the significance of so vast an achievement, love in its infinite beauty, and stand in awe at its grandeur. You want to talk a little bit about that?
It comes from Pico del Mirandola, who's a Renaissance Neoplatonist. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about the biologist. I mean, he had a take on how God created man to appreciate what God had made, and that man was part of God's creation. So it was God basically appreciating, revering himself in his creation. And the same thing for the biologist studying nature, and the same thing for the artist revering the natural world. We're part of this natural world. And when we go outside, we are, as an artist, as a poet, you are nature worshiping herself, itself. So
But you say in here that a painter should attempt to avoid developing any personal style in their work as it relates to that. Can you articulate why?
I think, like I said, my ideas on landscape painting at first, like I say, I wanted to study biology mainly because I loved studying the natural world. And then when I discovered painting, that to me seemed like a more immediate way of studying the natural world. Or to me, the study was sort of a reverence for it and trying to understand it. And painting was trying to understand it and revering it in a much more direct way. So I think some of my ideas, and I do move stuff around in the landscape, and I change stuff, and especially when I'm back in the studio, when I go outside, I try to be very respectful of nature, and, I walk much further trying to find a view that I find particularly inspiring. But to me, a lot of it is about revering and respecting the world the way it is, and not changing or imposing a style on it. I think a style will always come somewhat naturally, but I kind of resented the fact that I was always told I needed to develop a style, because I wasn't interested in developing a style. That wasn't why I wanted to be a painter. I wanted to be a painter to study nature. And so to me, it seemed forced to try to develop a style.
So, Marc, we have a lot of people listening to this who have just started painting, and we have a lot of people who are kind of going through their process. You had the benefit of going to Florence and studying, and of course now you have the benefit of many years of experience. Looking back, if you were advising somebody on what their track should be, or maybe what they should consider it to be in terms of the process of learning, what do you recommend now?
I mean, it's quite extraordinary how many wonderful schools there are out there today. Lots of great teachers. The internet has really changed everything as far as being able to find a good school. I think what's so valuable about studying at an Atelier or one of these, the Florence Academy, or there's like I say, there's lots in America too, is the focus on drawing. I think that drawing is so important to painting, and certainly when I was studying in America, I was very fortunate to get a teacher who understood that, and he tried to teach us, this was at UC Santa Cruz, tried to teach us a form of academic drawing, and that ended up being just crucial in my development. So I think the most important thing is to find somebody who can teach you drawing, basically. And then, from there, the painting, it's still very, very difficult, but if you can draw well, it certainly makes it easier when it comes to developing a subject in paint.
A lot of people believe that to become a good landscape painter, you need to do figures and portraits. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think it's not necessarily that you have to do figures and portraits, but generally working inside in a controlled environment is much easier. And especially these weak poses give you the amount of time it takes to really get into understanding shapes and a form and honing your drawing skills on a long project. Whereas going outside can be difficult in the sense that everything has changed so much. The lights, the sun's moving, the clouds are passing, the tourists are talking to you, the bugs are hitting the panel. It's just a lot more to think about. And I think that working in a studio environment, I think it's important not to put off studying landscape painting too late, because I've also seen really, really top studio painters go outside and get very frustrated because they're not used to not having control over their environment. So I think that, if you want to be a landscape painter, you should definitely start early, but that one of the best ways to learn how to draw and paint is in a studio.
What about photographs?
I personally don't use a lot of photographs, but I'm not opposed to it. I think I've seen some absolutely wonderful paintings done, entirely from a photograph. So I think one problem with photography, and it's a bit of a problem with site size too, is this idea that if you're just looking at the photograph and copying flatly the shapes, then you're probably not doing it right. The Russian schools have these, they managed to keep their tradition, and they have these, I've seen just incredible painters come out of these schools who have an understanding of form and color and paint. And thinking of one guy in particular, Evgeny Gruzchev, who from a tiny little black and white photograph did this absolutely, beautiful life-size portrait in full color, because he understands form and light and how to create it in oil paint. So I think that I have nothing against photography. I personally don't use it, because when I have used it, I wasn't as satisfied with the results as when I work entirely from life. But there are certainly lots of times when, for commission stuff in the past, I have used it, and sometimes I was pretty happy with the results.
So will you take you'll take studies you do in the field and bring them in for the studio and do larger paintings from those?
Yeah, and I often have photo references just in case I forgot something. But the problem with photography, for me anyways, is I can't trust the colors, I can't trust the values, I can't trust the shapes. If I have a photograph that I took and a sketch that I painted, to me the sketch, even though there's much less information, is 1,000 times more valuable. So I'll never do a painting entirely from a photo. I just really need the sketch because I trust, my own interpretation of the subject.
I think I remember seeing that you were doing larger on-location works, going out in multi-session periods. Is that accurate? Are you going out and doing bigger pieces on location?
Yeah, I've gotten very into making the most lightweight gear possible, and I now have this very large, very stable easel I'm quite proud of. And with that, I've been going out and doing quite large paintings, like I say, working outside, often near the house. It's I think I'm able to get a much more accurate impression for what I'm trying to achieve than if my studio work. I think there's something nice about studio work in that I'm much freer to change stuff, to move stuff around. I'm inventing much more. But like I say, I love this just to go outside and try to find a view that composes well, that is inspiring to me, and to really capture the beauty of the experience of standing in that spot. And obviously, to cover a large canvas, you need a fair amount of time. So I'll spend, a few weeks outside if I need to on a larger painting.
Like how large?
And it's fun to. I've done up to maybe 5 feet outside.
Have you really? How fun!
Yeah.
That's a whole different challenge of blowing winds.
Yeah, well, I picked a very sheltered spot. But also sometimes I've done figurative stuff outside where it'll take a while. Also in the spring, where you have the weather is changing, and I'll have trouble with the grass growing and the leaves coming in, and then if you start in sort of mid-April and then you end in June, you've got sort of 3 feet of grass. So.
Well, next mid-April, you're going to be in San Francisco on stage at the PleinAir convention. We're pretty excited about that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think I became a landscape painter because of how beautiful Central California is. So I'm always happy to come back.
But you grew up in California.
Yeah, I was born in Los Angeles. I actually lived as a kid in the Fiji Islands, and moved to LA when I was 10. And then I remember I went to UC Santa Cruz, and I would drive from Los Angeles up to Santa Cruz, and I was so awestruck by the beauty of Central Californian coast and inland, to be honest, that was really when I just fell in love with the natural beauty of that part of the world, and decided that I should become a landscape painter and try to capture it. California also had a great tradition of Impressionism. So
yeah, I'm going to become a California landscape painter and then move to Italy.
Yeah, well, I got sidetracked.
Well, there are a lot of areas of California that look a lot like Italy.
Yeah, we have similar light. So
yeah, it's well, I haven't had a lot of chance to paint over there, but I'm looking forward to it. I'll be over there in September. We're bringing the Fine Art Connoisseur art tour to Florence and Rome, and so hopefully I'll slip out. Maybe you and I could go painting.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you doing this today with us, Marc. Any final thoughts?
No, I think Italy is a wonderful place to paint if anyone is, or to study if anyone is considering learning how to paint. I think Florence is a wonderful, any of the Italian cities really, because they're also just so full of art. They say 70% of the Western civilization's cultural objects are here in Italy, and you really feel it when you live here. It's just every little church has these masterworks, and you're just surrounded by art and beauty. So,
well, just briefly, because I just thought of one other question I wanted to ask you, because I like to ask, typically when you're teaching a workshop or you're working with students in plein air painting, are there particular things that you find a lot of problems are in common that people should be working on?
One thing I think a lot about lately, I used to tell all my students that values were the most important thing. I think it was DeCamp who said, if you get the values right, nothing else matters. But one thing I've noticed lately, and this is true of my own work, but I see it a lot in other artists' work, even professional artists, is this repetition of shapes. I think that you want variety in your painting always, variety of edge, variety of hue, variety of value. But I think I've noticed in works where I come home and my own work is unsatisfactory, I'll often realize that 2 or 3 of the larger elements are all the same size. And I've started to notice that about other artists' work as well, and especially with beginning students. Our brain really looks for patterns, and so we tend to we see a line of cypress trees, and we'll just go cypress tree, cypress tree, cypress tree, all the same. And obviously, you need to really focus on the small one, the big one, the thin one, the fat one, and get that variety. But even in design, I think that if you have larger elements in the foreground, medium size in the middle distance, smaller as you get back. And even there was one painting that I had to send out to a gallery, and the gallerist wasn't very happy with it. And I was looking at it, and I realized that, it's like a flag. The foreground is one size, the middle ground is one size, and the distance is one size, or the sky is one size. And I didn't notice it at the time because I was thinking about so many other things. So I think this repetition of elements is something that I see a lot of beginning students putting in their work, and that sort of design needs to be considered and worked out and fixed.
I looking at your website, I noticed that you do, first off, everything I think is beautiful, but some of the work that you do of architecture, of buildings and houses, is just spectacular. And I think that's one thing we all have trouble with, is how do you make it look right? And I know drawing skill is obviously the first and foremost, but do you have any tips on painting architecture?
I mean, I tend to put less detail in than perhaps I should. I mean, honestly, a lot of my ideas on certainly Italian architecture come from looking at Corot's paintings. So like one little trick I always show the students is, if you want to paint a window, don't paint the window and then the frame around it. If you look at what Corot was doing, he would just put one big square down for the frame and then a smaller square in the middle for a rectangle for the window. And it's that sort of simplification. I don't look for a lot of detail in the paintings. I was actually listening to a podcast of yours, and artists, and I think lots of artists were saying that they would start with the darks. I was always taught to start with the sky, to key the sky first. And then when I'm working on buildings, I tend to key the buildings off of the sky. And that tends to take them quite dark up at the top. And then I'll often artificially lighten them as I get down towards the ground, so then I can put in more dark accents to give the sense of the lightness of the building.
Excellent. So. Good tip. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, Marc, thanks for being on the podcast today, and we're looking forward to seeing you at the PleinAir convention in San Francisco, and I will see you hopefully in September. I'll give you a heads up before I come.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Marc is an amazing guy, and I really am very appreciative of him being on the show. Thank you again, Marc. The podcast was sponsored by the Publishers Invitational Art Retreat, Fall Color Week in Banff in the Canadian Rockies, Lake Louise, that area. It's beautiful. We still got seats left. You can check it out at publishersinvitational.com. While you're there, you can also learn about some of the other things we do. And we have African Painting Safari, which is our other sponsor. It's a chance to experience a bucket list trip. Go to africanpaintingsafari.com. Also, if you've not seen my blog where I talk about life and art and just life, check it out. It's called Sunday Coffee. You can find it at coffeewitheric.com. A lot of .coms to remember here. PleinAir movement is red hot, which may be why the PleinAir magazine continues to prevail. Thank you very much for buying it. It's number one nationwide at Barnes & Noble in the art category. That's very exciting for us. And it's really saying a lot about what's happening with the PleinAir movement, which is exploding. If you're new to PleinAir, pick up a copy of PleinAir magazine. It's a great way to learn how to paint. It's a great way to learn what other people are doing, and of course see the beautiful paintings and follow the events and the collectors. There's a lot going on. You can get it at pleinairmagazine.com. It's always fun doing this, and we'll do it again sometime again soon, like next week. So we'll see you then, God willing. I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of PleinAir magazine. Remember, it's a big world out there, and you need to go paint it. We'll see you. Bye-bye.